This is the Comics Alternative for Young Readers, a review of The Stone Heart, and a discussion of Paste Magazine's article, Required Reading, 50 of the Best Kids Comics.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative. I'm Gwen.
And I'm Paul, and we're two academics talking about comics for young readers.
On this episode of the Comics Alternative's Young Readers Show, we'll be reviewing The Stone Heart by Faith Erin Hicks, colors by Jordi Belair. This is from First Second Books, and it's part 2 of the Nameless City trilogy.
We're also going to be discussing a recent article from Paste Magazine entitled "Required Reading: 50 of the Best Kids Comics," and we'll be talking about that article and the 50 comics that are recommended there. And I'm excited to inform you listeners about a new book that I'm sure will be of interest to you. It's called Graphic Novels for Children and Young Adults: A Collection of Critical Essays. It's from University Press of Mississippi, and it's edited by Michelle Ann Abate and none other than our very own Gwen Tarbox. Yay! And so I get to ask Gwen a few questions about the book. And that'll serve as a sort of a preview because an upcoming episode of the Comics Alternative will feature a roundtable discussion of that collection with Gwen and a few other contributors to that book. So we'll kind of introduce that book here today.
Yeah, we're really excited about that. Before we start today's show, though, I want to remind everybody that our program is sponsored by Discount Comic Book Service. Head over to dcbservice.com for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. Every week, DCBS has DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles for 40% off, and many other publishers' comics regularly run between 20 and 35% off of the list price. In fact, DCBS has specials, Paul, that run 45 to 50% off the cover price. And
wow.
Often the discounts are more impressive than that. Too bad they don't sell Kleenex and decongestant, because I could use it anyway. But they do sell awesome comics, so head over to dcbsservice.com or their sister site, In Stock Trades, for all of your comics needs.
In fact, for May, even though this is our April episode, if you can time travel back in time, but for May, there's a DC Kids bundle that's only $4.47, and you're saving 50% off of titles like Scooby-Doo, Where Are You? number 83, Scooby-Doo Team Up number 28, and Looney Tunes number 238. All those are available in the DC Kids bundle, which is there at Discount Comic Book Service, where I also pick up, my regular dose of comics. And so you're going to find great deals to go with that. All kinds of other steals available for comics of all ages at Discount Comic Book Service.
That's right. And when you do order with DCBS Service, be sure to tell them that Paul and Gwen sent you. Well, this month we are really excited to talk about Faith Erin Hicks, The Stone Heart. And actually, Paul, I think you recently listened to an episode that Andy and I did back when The Nameless City debuted, the first volume in the trilogy. And so, it should be a lot of fun to talk about that today. And I want to apologize to listeners that our April show didn't come on sooner. As you can probably hear, I am just recovering from probably the worst head cold of my entire life. And so we had to postpone our recording until now. And even now, I've come to the conclusion, Paul, that my name and the title Nameless City is really hard to say when you have a cold. So I need to have a talk with Faith Erin Hicks about titling her books. I mean, The Stone Heart I could do just fine, but Nameless City that's so easy.
That's funny. Well, yeah, and my apologies for the lateness as well. And Gwen, we're just glad that you can make it and you feel well enough. It seems like my body has a way of holding out until the end of the semester, and then right as it closes, my immune system collapses. So maybe it's just that scheduled time of year,
Yeah, I do. It's so funny. I said, here's 2 sets of final exams and a head cold.
Right.
Congratulations. But also we do want to let people know we will also have a May show, right, Paul? So
we will. Yes. In May, in fact, we're going to be talking about a couple of other books that are May releases. One entitled Real Friends and another Volcano Trash. And then in June, Gwen, I think we're going to be talking about the Eisner nominees were announced, and as Gwen and Andy Wolverton made an annual tradition here, we'll be talking about the various young reader categories in the Eisner nominations. So that'll be an exciting episode to come.
Absolutely.
Well, should we get into the Stoneheart, Gwen?
Let's do it.
Cool. Well, as you mentioned last year, Gwen, you and Andy Wolverton reviewed the first volume of the Nameless City trilogy, and we're discussing today the second volume entitled The Stoneheart. And I did go back and listen to that episode. It's April 11th, if you'd like to go to comicsalternative.com and find the archives. And, I thought that you and Andy had a great conversation about it. In fact, listening to your podcast episode last year was really fun for me to read, to listen to alongside reading the work. And I fully agreed with your sentiments about the book, which was that Faith Erin Hicks did a tremendous job of creating this vast epic scaled story in a fictional world with that bears, I think, a clear resemblance or inspiration to Asia. You mentioned that Hicks had spent quite a lot of time researching 14th century China, for instance. And you and Andy mentioned your appreciation of the story's exploration of the kind of social structure and stratification of the society here in this city that's called the Nameless City because it's been conquered and colonized repeatedly by different civilizations. And so it's come to have so many names that its indigenous people have just called it the Nameless City. And so you and Andy also pointed out that besides this sort of picture of a city, of the vast social scale of the city, there's also just what the other thing that Faith Erin Hicks does so well, which is to tell a story that is built around relationships, particularly between young people, but also the adults. And so although this is a departure in terms of setting from her previous work, she uses those same talents for, creating these characters and these relationships that we're really invested in our 2 main protagonists, Kaidu and Rat. And so I think on the whole, you had very positive things to say about the first volume, which I fully agreed with. And so I'm very interested, and maybe we can render our general judgments or opinions before diving into spoilers for this story. Whether you felt like the second volume, the second edition had any sequel slump or did it really live up to the high standards that the first volume set? What did you think, Gwen?
Well, I actually thought it was better in many ways in terms of its very tight plotting.
Yeah.
The story moves in multiple directions this time, and that makes sense in a way because the first volume of any trilogy is usually simply establishing things like the characters, their relations with each other, the setting. But in the second volume, things start to happen geopolitically in a number of ways that are quite fascinating and gripped my attention. And so from the perspective of plot structuring, I thought it was a very strong text. I think that the thing that still lingers for me that I alluded to briefly in that April episode is that it is still, for me, a little bit problematic when an author appropriates a culture. Even though this is a fantasy culture, it's clearly based in another part of the world. And so I'm always very cautious when I read a text where someone is writing about a culture other than their own, even if it is indeed primarily a fictive culture. That said, most of the clothing, the setting, the city itself, all are reminiscent of illustrations that Hicks accessed through her research, and I do commend her for doing that research, but I feel a little bit differently about that than I would say of Jean Luen Yang writing Boxers and Saints and doing research on a specific historical time period. Right. And so, on the one hand, you have to say that Hicks has created very rich visual culture in this text, but I could also see how some readers might question that. And so I don't want to leave that unsaid, because I really do actually appreciate the storytelling very much in these volumes, and I appreciate Hicks' talents both as an artist and a writer. But there are some I can't talk honestly about the book without at least mentioning those minor reservations that I have.
Sure.
So I don't know how you feel about that, or if it inflected your reading at all.
Yeah, it certainly did, and it's something that I think about all the time, although probably in a little bit of a different way, although I completely sympathize with your hesitations about it. And it is exactly that notion of depicting another culture. I think you had a very nuanced and an important conversation about that when you and Andy discussed Ghost and by Raina Telgemeier, and actually particularly the episode after your first conversation about that book. And you and I have spoken a little bit about this idea of cultural appropriation, which I think has especially pointed relevance in comics for young readers for a number of reasons. Because I think there's this impulse, and it's a great one for all literature, but particularly for youth, to reflect the diversity of readers, and to and so it's a I think worth applauding when creators really try to go outside of their own their own upbringing, their own background, their own environment, and at the same time, then you run the risk sometimes, especially when you come from a certain position or a certain culture with a certain amount of power or privilege to represent an other. I tend to be really sensitive to those kinds of concerns as well. My take on and my feeling about this, though, I think this instance in particular, being the Nameless City, is that to me what Hicks is working out of is, to me, more of a cosmopolitan ethic, which I think I've said that word before with you, than one that's so much cultural appropriation, or you might more pointedly call it Orientalism of the type that literary theorist Edward Said called it, where it's a construction of the East by somebody from the West. Instead, I feel like there's a way that the culture is portrayed monolithically, and there's something that's much more about the layers and sort of a kind of integration of cultures, and not integration that doesn't include recognition of power dynamics or kind of colonial type legacies or injustice. Certainly, those are sort of explicitly addressed by the story, but it's also a sensibility that we're a world that there's not there's not just East and West. We're all steeped in our traditions and locations, but there's a world that is very much being created because we have these kind of world city type places where people come from all parts of the world, and in a sense, for better or for worse, leave behind a mark or a legacy on a place, which is very much what this story is about.
Right. And I think also the open discussion that the characters have about things like who gets to name whom, and what you can forget and what you cannot forget when it comes to your own cultural past. I think those things are handled very sensitively. And I was really pleased with how that was done. But I do agree that I think it's important, especially when we're talking about visual representation of peoples, that we think about what a young reader might take away from this text. And actually, I feel more comfortable with this than I did with what Telgemeier did in Ghosts, because of course, what Telgemeier was doing was actually depicting a specific cultural milieu, and that was not her own. Whereas this is a fictive reality that I think, as you say, is addressing a lot of the way that the future is going to look. And it's an imaginary that, yes, comes out of the mind of a person who's been raised in the West, but obviously has tried to be sensitive to an entire genre of comics that are set in Asia. So, it's. I think you're right. I think it's worth mentioning. I don't think we wouldn't want to not talk about it, but I would also say that in this case, because Hicks so frequently brings up in the text just these issues of colonization, of the legacy of colonization, that it actually makes the text somewhat of a commentary on itself, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so I felt that was maybe in a way, especially I see this profoundly in the second volume, where you really begin to get a sense for the geopolitical interactions of a number of different countries that have vied for this particular city. You get the perspectives of so many other characters and their subject positions in relation to each other.
Yeah.
That I think it really helps to complicate our discussion even of what we mean by cosmopolitan. So I was impressed by that.
Yeah, me too. And you're right. It's right there in the title. In a sense, I think Hicks is rather boldly, aspiring to really tell a story that's grounded in specific characters. We know this is about Kai and Rat and so forth, and all the principles that we've come to care about, but is very much tackling the questions, the issues of being a city, and not just any city, but a city at the crossroads. And I think that's really fascinating.
Right. And I do have to say, too, that Hicks herself has addressed this in a recent interview that she did with Matthew Funk for, I think, Blaster.com. She said, and I actually have to put on my glasses because, yes, we're at that place. She said, for The Nameless City, even though the story is fantasy and the world is fictional, I was drawing inspiration from a culture and a history not my own, and I wanted to do so with as much sensitivity as possible. I wasn't only writing people who were very different from me, but I was drawing them as well. I wanted to create a rich, multicultural world with a long history, and I wanted all of that history to be apparent on the page. And I really appreciate how, this is me now, I really, unquote, I really appreciate how Hicks does acknowledge the power of visual imagery in especially our apprehending people and cultures. And so I think for educators who are planning to use this text, perhaps, turning to Hicks herself and her commentary on her own work would be a nice way to enter into a discussion of this text and the visuals with young readers.
Yeah, I agree. And, I hope this isn't too much of a digression. I really mean this about this book, but I do think that comics, when you think about a cosmopolitan way of viewing the world, and I don't sort of endorse that as the absolute, this is what we all should do and teach. But I think if you are trying to imagine a world where, where I think we live with difference, and not only as how do we deal with these foreign invaders, but really as this is the lifeblood of who we are. If you live in a diverse kind of place, I think that teaching kids to pay attention, teaching really all of us, not just kids, to pay attention to visual and aesthetic communication and symbolism, and the way that imagery is so much part of how we construct or reconstruct our view of ourselves and others is really important. And so, from a kind of from a kind of decolonizing perspective, where I'm well aware of particularly American comics, for instance, history of depicting Asian peoples a certain way, in a way that is not flattering to me or to my ancestors or my family.
And not flattering to the people who drew them.
Absolutely.
Right? I mean,
absolutely. Right. But rather than running from imagery or from visual language, instead seeing how visual language can do something to throw that word in again, cosmopolitan, where even in visual styles and in the way that, say, architecture and fashion is depicted, you can show a kind of synthesis, a kind of, hybridity of communication, of expression, of celebration. And I think that Hicks's art bears traces of that. We talked a few months ago about newsprints by Rushu, and I think there's a similar integration of visual influences east and west in that work as well, that I think is all that to say, I think comics can do a really cool thing when it comes to portraying, depicting, and imagining a kind of hybrid world. And I think this is an instance of that for me.
Yeah, and it's been done well enough that I don't know if you know, but Hicks just signed a contract to convert this or to adapt it into the 3 books will be split into 12 half-hour episodes for probably, I'm assuming, airing on something like Netflix or Amazon or something like that. She's just signed a deal with Federator to do this for Nameless City. And so we will now have the visuals. I mean, she's created obviously a very convincing world, and those visuals will now be, broadcast to probably a much larger audience, because as much as you and I love comics and as successful as this comic will be, we also know that adaptation of comics almost always tend to draw people in who would not normally read a comic book. Yeah. So, her audience is about to get much larger, and so these questions become even more interesting and intriguing. Right. It will be fascinating to see how much involvement that she has on what the drawings look like, how the live action, if it's live action, if it's right. comics, what it will look like. That will be quite fascinating. And I was thinking too of Delilah Dirks. That will now be also, I think, a film. I think Disney's making a film of that. So a lot of comics that we've been talking about the last couple of years that involve sort of this extensive world building are now actually going to make their way to the silver screen or to television.
Absolutely. Comics are the hotbed of, culture's next big thing.
It starts with Gwen and Paul and it ends up on the big screen. There we go.
There we go. Let's pat ourselves on the back. But I think it does bear mentioning also the other comparison that always comes to mind when I'm reading Nameless City, this trilogy, which is, there's a tag quote or whatever you call them, an endorsement on the cover from Avatar: The Last Airbender's one of its 2 creators, and so I think that's a good comparison as well, in the sense of having an Asian inspired world that is fantasy nonetheless, and that is again a kind of fusion of East and West. And I'm reminded of, you mentioned Gene Luen Yang earlier and Boxers and Saints, but I'm reminded of the that television series Avatar: The Last Airbender, and then the film, which was a horrible adaptation that race bended or whitewashed that cast, but that the response from Gene Luen Yang to that, which prompted the show's creators to invite him to be the writer of the series from Dark Horse, and so the sort of extension of that universe in the comics is a example of the reversed kind of adaptation from what's going to happen with Nameless City. But I think a similar kind of world and again, aesthetic is happening there. And, I thought about that often.
Yeah. The production value, I guess we should talk a little bit about the production values and maybe even, talk a little bit about the age range for this comic. Sure, is this one that you would read with your daughter, do you think?
Well, the story is when Nameless City came out last year, I thought it was maybe going to be a little bit over her head, but literally half an hour ago, I handed the first volume to her and she's done. And she's waiting for us to finish recording this so that she can please get started on the Stoneheart because she can't wait. So she's loving it.
Good.
It's hit home with her. But I do think you're right that it's probably targeted for a little above. My daughter's 6. So maybe a little bit older.
Probably a tween audience, wouldn't you say? Yeah.
Yes.
I think that's definitely, especially because in the second volume, we get introduced to Rat's social circle. Right. And that includes some young people who befriend Kai as well. And you definitely have a couple interludes there, which feel very much, Faith Erin Hicks is back in her high school or middle school element with that part of the text. I was kind of laughing about it because we know that she's quite well known for her comic set in high school called Friends with Boys. And in fact, in one of her interviews, she joked about how drawing Nameless City was certainly a break from drawing high school lockers and, that sort of thing. But in a way, there are some elements in Nameless City, the trilogy of basically tween kids getting to know each other, having little crushes on each other and that sort of thing. And that does come out. And so it's a sweet interlude in the middle of the text. But yeah, I would say that probably our young readers, who are age 8, 9 and above would probably enjoy this. But I also think teen readers would like it as well, because the plot is gripping. There's the questions that are being raised could have resonance for different age groups. Maybe many younger readers might look at this more for the interpersonal relationships, but the older one is, and the more one is aware of what's going on geopolitically in our lives right now, there's a lot of conversation, especially in The Stone Heart, that has resonance for those of us who are adults. So
absolutely. Yeah. And I want to, second that as far as Faith Erin Hicks's work here, really reaching a new level. But, even in, I've read Brain Camp and Adventures of Superhero Girl, and, most of those are fairly light. But there's always, I think, a certain awareness. I remember really subtle references to, geopolitics or cultural issues that show up there in that kind of work. And I've actually been fortunate enough to meet Faith Erin Hicks once. She was at Alternative Press Expo, in San Francisco a few years back. And we spoke briefly. I'm sure she has no memory of it, but, she was just, as you probably imagine, incredibly, affable and kind but also just very, very aware. And I've rarely felt so, comfortable and, to be honest, welcomed speaking to a creator. And I just got a sense of her, and I get the same sense of her from her social media presence and so on, that she is, not preachy, but very engaged, in things that are happening in the world. And so I think you're right that, there's a lot of the teen drama with, Rat's friends, Iniko and Hanya. But I saw in that same scene that you're referring to, I think around page 38, and, we can delve into the book a little bit more. So if you're trying to be spoiler free, you can jump ahead to the next part of the episode in the show notes there. But, in that scene where we meet, Rat's friends, I think there's also a great contrast between the kind of artistic, and then we also see in the actual monastery, the Stone Heart, the kind of spiritual culture between those kind of, sort of cultural expressions and the very militaristic culture that plays such a huge role, in this story as well.
Right. And I think it's funny because a number of the characters from time to time, events either that they are very much of their culture or their cultural traditions, or they feel that they are out of step with them. And certainly Kai doesn't feel like a warrior. That's mentioned again and again. And it's interesting, in Stone Heart, you learn that that's true about his father as well, which you might not assume from just what you had sort of seen of him up until that point, as a military general. But you do learn a lot of backstory as well about Rat's parents, about Kai's parents, and about some of the other characters in the text, including Mura and her background, and how she, I love Jordi Belair's choice of eye color for Mura. She stands out in such an interesting way in this series, just from that little touch. It really is, it carries a lot in terms of basically locating her in the story as a mysterious presence. And and
when we get some of her backstory around page 78, right? And again, Belair's colors sort of wash it out, so that because it's depicting a memory of when Mura's attachment, you can see to Erzi, the up and coming emperor here. But in those scenes, that eye color that you're talking about, even in a desaturated page like that, jump out because it's this green, right? Yeah, that's really well done.
I love Jordi Belair, just as an aside. She is so amazing.
Yes.
I would like her to decorate my house, coordinate my wardrobe. She just really gets color and knows how to move narrative via the judicious use of, as you say, not just things like washes and that sort of thing, but just in general, the color palettes for the different societies that are represented is fascinating too.
Yeah. I hope this isn't overstating it, but I think all of comicsdom is a Jordi Belair fan club, and I think she, history is going to remember her as a revelation. Obviously, there's a lot of other great colorists, but she's just phenomenal.
And she has a great name to go with it, so you just kind of.
the Fresh Prince is
That's
what
right.
I always think of. But actually, as you were talking about with these characters and the way that they're drawn, and I agree with you. I think second volume, obviously because it gets to build on the first, but it doesn't drop off in quality at all. To me, I agree with you that it's even better than the first, and especially because of the complexity that's introduced with the characters. As you were talking about Mura, and we learn about her backstory, and also, I mean, even well, this is now deep into spoilers, but even Ertz's turn, his sort of heel turn towards becoming quite the villain in this. There's enough background to it that you can see that he's been overtaken by this sense. I remember the scene where somebody, a Tao, soldier looks at him and says something's wrong with him, that boy, like he's not Tao, and you can tell this sort of obsession with proving his Tao-ness, his warlikeness, really wanting that mantle of the, not the conqueror, but the ruler, it's just I think all the characters unfolded in a way that was, to me, believable and intriguing and ratcheted up the tension, in the story.
And we get not one, but two cliffhangers. And yes. I find that to be really awesome as well. So it really makes, I know that Hicks is busily drawing the final volume in the trilogy. And I'm like, hurry up. I want to see it now. Absolutely. Yeah. I love it. I think the pace, once a year is impressive for, how grand a narrative this is. So I'll patiently wait for volume 3, but see, Paul is patient. I'm not. And this is, once I get into a story world and it captures my interest, then I want resolution, darn it.
Yeah.
So basically, I'm like the person who wants the whole series to drop at once, like on Netflix, and then I can just binge read this whole having to wait for a while,
Yeah. But especially because the narrative has so much momentum, it wants to run the way the characters run.
Yeah, this is definitely not a sophomore slump. This is really a great second volume. This is a very rich series, and I'm very excited to read 3, and I think the trilogy is going to stand the test of time. And of course, now that we know it's going to be televised, it will take on a whole different cast. But it is exciting that we've had the chance to get through 2 volumes. Let's just hurry up for 3.
Absolutely. All right. Cool. Well, Gwen, do you want to go on to talk about our other topics today?
Absolutely.
Okay.
One of the things that both Paul and I noticed, since we're on social media together as well, here and there in the interwebs, is that Paste came out, was it about a week ago, Paul, with a list of their, what they called basically the 50 must-read children's comics of all time.
Yes.
And to
tall order.
It is. And and I thought what I would do to start off with, and we'll link the issue in our show notes, but if you don't mind, Paul, why don't I go ahead and read the introduction that the Paste editors created for their discussion then of these 50 texts. So they said, determining the criteria for a list of the best children's comics of all time is a bit more challenging than picking the best horror, sci-fi, or webcomics. We are, by the legal definition, if not emotionally, adults. And many of the works on this list hit shelves well after we aged out of the target audience range. That leaves us with the task of duly evaluating the comics below. Are they good, first and foremost, and are they good or valuable to children? Heck, even determining our criteria for children was tough, and we ultimately settled on the full gamut from beginning readers through to preteens, although many of us begin reading adult comics in our upper teen years. But every title in this alphabetically ordered catalog has the potential to mean something special, to offer something valuable and important, whether that's revelatory depth or escapist fun, to a young reader. From wordless animal adventures to complicated teen identity sagas, these books form an all-ages canon worthy of the budding comic children in your life. And so, Paul, that was a tall order, and we can maybe talk a little bit about their criteria in a minute. But from what just so our readers understand, they then put an alphabetical list by title of 50 titles that ranged from the A's, Abigail and the Snowman by Roger Legridge, all the way down to Zeta the Space Girl by Ben Hatke.
A to Z, right?
A to Z, and lots of texts in between, including Faith Erin Hicks, The Nameless City. So the book that we talked, the trilogy that we talked about today. And so that was really what the PACE list was all about. Paul, I know that you did some really snazzy PhD Berkeley analysis on the list. So why don't you share with our audience some of the findings from your thinking about this list?
There's nothing so snazzy PhD about it, but I definitely, I think that three reactions come to me. And, I sort of made a little table for myself. And one of them, the first reaction was the of course list, which, of course with a period at the end. It's those titles on here that I think probably would be a near consensus belong on a list such as this. Of course, this is, I think, a very sort of American-based perspective, but things like American-Born Chinese or Anya's Ghost or Bone or Drama, things that I think most fans, most watchers of this kind of work would agree belong on such a list. And then I had a category called wow, which is things that I'm excited showed up on the list, although I wouldn't have necessarily expected or things that I guess I shouldn't take for granted that are being acknowledged and recognized on this list. And my third category, and really not meant to be an insult to anything that wound up there, was really ? In the sense that there were things that surprised me, maybe because I just wasn't as familiar with them, but also I didn't necessarily feel the same cultural impact that you would expect from something that would show up on a top 50 kids comics list.
Right.
And then separately, I made another list that was what about ... ellipses, which was my list of things that I thought may have been left off the list. So I'm super curious, Gwen, whether you had things that jumped to mind in any of those categories for you, and sort of also want to ask you your general thoughts about the notion of compiling a list like this and what purposes they serve and things like that. But was there anything that was for you a really ? Like a surprise that it showed up here?
Well, it's interesting because maybe I'll answer your questions in reverse order. I think making these lists is very difficult. Anyone who's set about trying to make a list of even one's own favorites will find that becomes a pretty complicated project to undertake. Yeah. But I think part of my issue with this particular list is I really appreciate that the folks who compiled it found it difficult and challenging, and that they wanted to have a list of what was quote unquote good, but they don't list their criteria. So it's left to us, the reader, to try to figure that out. And, I'm sure that this was a combination, one can imagine, of, both a lot of these books, for instance, showed up on the New York Times book review, book review list back when they were doing children's comics, such as A Wrinkle in Time, by Hope Larson's adaptation of Madeleine L'Engle's text, very famous science fiction text. So, that made a lot of sense to me. But then there are choices that they made for things like, for instance, Garfield or Nancy, or, these long running comics, some of which weren't intended for children originally. And I'm thinking of Calvin and Hobbes, yes, read by many, many children, foundational comics for many young readers. But technically speaking, we're talking about a real dual address text whenever we're looking at comic strips. Right. Those comic strips, when they show up in the Sunday paper, are meant to be family fare, which means that we're looking at a pretty broad readership there. And so I was surprised, for instance, not to see Tony Cliff's Delilah Dirk's series, but on the other hand, to either see Garfield or, and by the way, I love Garfield. I have a good friend who's writing on Garfield right now, so this isn't me. Yeah. But again, I was just kind of surprised on Top 50 Children's Comics to see that. And then there was a edition of one of the Supergirl comics, Cosmic Adventures in 8th Grade by Landry Q. Walker and Eric Jones and DC Comics. And it's a sweet comic. We both read it. But I was kind of surprised to see it sitting right next to This One Summer, and and something like Secret Coders, which is pretty generally recognized to be an excellent text that looks at STEM research and the way that we can get kids interested in STEM. So it was just sort of fascinating to see the wide variety of texts, and so there were some wow moments for me. But what I would have appreciated more than the list itself would have been a real attempt by the editors and the reviewers to talk about the criteria and how they came about with it. I believe they had criteria. I would just like to have seen more of that. And you and I are really lucky because when we do our Eisner show, we're going to be taking a list that's been set up, but we also know that list has been created by individuals who have been working in the field for a long time, have earned their places on the Eisner committees, and have a lot of expertise they're drawing on to make the determinations of what comics show up on that list. And even then we argue with them, right? Of course. But we know that we're arguing with folks who have a long history of working with comics. And it's not that probably these folks don't, but I just really would have liked to have seen a little bit more of a rationale, because then it would have maybe been easier for me to understand why that comic was there.
Yeah. And I think that's a difference between, say, cultural commentary or journalism and, the kind of academic context that you and I often work in, which is, anytime you do a list or it's kind of a canon creation, right? And it's an exercise in defining something. And I think being transparent about your criteria or methodology is really important in some contexts, and in others, they try to let the list speak for itself, and it's meant to provoke and instigate some discussion or disagreement. And,
which it did among our friend group. Certainly there were lots of our friends on Facebook or Twitter who were talking about the list. So it certainly did that. And, I don't want to knock it entirely. I was excited, for instance, to see Eric Orchard's Bear the One-Headed Troll on here. Not only is it a recent release, but it's one of those sort of high art comics that I was excited to see here, because I think it really represents some of the best of the new generation of comics creators who are coming up and putting out some really provocative work for young readers that's challenging. And seeing that on the list was really exciting.
Yeah, that showed up on my wow exclamation point list as well. Yeah, I mean, I think some of my thoughts are along the same lines as yours, which is that there are things that are surprises. And I can see an attempt to include some categories that I really appreciate, but I also wondered about the inclusions and exclusions in those categories. For instance, you mentioned the comic strip collections, and I think it is right on as far as what shows up in libraries and in kids' hands.
Right.
That Calvin and Hobbes is on the list. And, whatever you may feel about it, and I feel similarly, Garfield. I know many an immigrant kid who sort of grew up reading on Garfield, and myself included. So I understand that, but I also, it doesn't, I don't know, I can't stand to read another Garfield comic strip, but Nancy, I thought was really interesting in terms of showing up there. That was on sort of my wow list, but it seems to me strange that you would, canonize those three strips and leave out, say, Peanuts or Pogo or even Boondocks or something like that.
Or even Little Orphan Annie, which came to be like, it became a multimedia sensation, So,
absolutely. Yeah. And also, I mean, I think as far as reaching outside of, the United States as an origin, I thought it was interesting, the inclusion of works like, Kitaro, which I've also read.
Yay,
and,
right?
Right. Good stuff. That was on my wow exclamation point list as well. But, I think there's probably some manga mainstays, things like Astro Boy and things like that
right.
weren't on those that were surprising. So I do like the inclusion of it, the way that it shows how broad comics are. Like I'd be proud to hand this list to one of these folks that claim that there's not, literary merit for comics for kids, and to say, look at all the stuff that's here from Hereville to,
right.
Nathan Hale, and I'd be proud of that list. But then, I think that also leads me to wonder about some other things that could have been on the list, and weren't.
Well, I'm really sensitive to these questions because I'm in the middle of writing a book that's trying to define children's comics. And the very act of doing that indicates that we're still at a place in the field where we aren't entirely sure how we're defining children's comics. And I've given a lot of thought to this because I know that my book will be one of maybe 3 or 4 that are directly addressing that question that will come out over the next few years. And I understand that the dialogue that we're having right now is going to, help to determine what the field looks like. So I'm sensitive to those questions, and I understand that Paste Magazine isn't trying to do that. So I don't want to, criticize them. But all I'm trying to say is it does bring up, I think, questions that you and I regularly ask ourselves, and I'm sure some of our listeners do as well, about what we really mean by children's comics. And there are times when Andy and I, back in the day, there was a comic that we reviewed called Moose, and it came out last year. I think it was on the Eisners last year. And I'm sorry, I can't remember the author off the top of my head, but it was actually a really intense, extremely disturbing comic that was beautifully rendered. But Andy and I spent a lot of time on the podcast talking to parents about age, the age range for someone who could read that comic and maybe not need some kind of adult guidance to read it.
Right.
And so, this is what makes children's comics exciting and fun, but also really complicated is what is it, and I don't think we're ever going to have a firm definition because, quite frankly, the creative artists who are writing for children are diverse, and many of them, that was, I think, my other point, that I'd made earlier too. It sort of circles back to that. To me, there's a really big difference between a comics creator who is writing specifically for children and a comics creator whose work gets read by children. And that's like where Jeff Smith's Bone comes in. He did not write that for kids. He says that, he goes on record every time he talks about it. Well, I did not write this for kids. It's great that they like it. Whereas we know that Tegelmeyer was writing drama for a middle grade readership. So, it's slightly different there too. And so it's kind of exciting to be part of a field that's so thorny. It's hard to define.
Hard to define and emergent in many ways. I mean, I think that Bone story exemplifies that because he didn't write it even through, I think, I remember when the single issues of Bone were coming out and we were collecting them as teenagers, and my friend and I were just looking at him saying, who is this for? It looks so different from Youngblood or something that's also coming out in this format. And in some ways the audience created by just its hunger, created the marketing for that title specifically, and then that title paved the way, I think, for a lot of things in terms of format and audience and stuff. But I mean, it is very emergent, and while there are a lot of things that when you look at the bestseller list for kids comics, that are becoming pretty standardized, that's one of the great things about this medium or, set of genres or whatever, right? Is that it's a little fuzzy at the borders, and that makes it more intriguing, I think.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I do thank Paste for the fun thing, the provocation that such a list provides. And I just want to mention one last thing for me. And I don't know if you have a few others that are, either exclusions or inclusions that you were excited about, but I was really excited to see Yotsuba on this list. I don't know if you've read Yotsuba, but
I haven't.
It is a really fun manga. I think it was originally published about 10 years ago, but a pretty long series that has been translated and is now in 14 or so volumes. And I got to tell you, I'm not a huge manga reader, although I'm becoming more so in large part thanks to our manga episodes of the Comics Alternative. But Yotsuba is one that I've read with my family, actually my daughter and my wife, who is not normally a comics reader, and we've just had such a kick. It's so fun, Gwen. I'll send you Yotsuba, the first couple of volumes, and you'll be hooked. So that's a recommendation that I was delighted to see that was on the list.
Yeah, I thought it was a really sweet list. And actually, I was happy to see many of the comics that we reviewed on the Comics Alternative showed up on this list.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And so it was, again, I mean, like Bear, the one-headed troll, I know that I'm maybe belaboring this, but I not only loved that comic, but it's now forming the basis of a chapter in the book I'm writing because I think it's doing such interesting things with the dual audience concept of Orchard sort of talking to adults, talking to kids, and it's dealing with monstrosity and the monstrous, and in ways that I think a lot of other really revolutionary children's comics creators are doing, like Drew Wing with his, I think it's Wang, his the Creepy Case Files of Margot Malou, which is also dealing with monsters in a really interesting way, and so I was excited to see those texts on this list, and happy that we'd reviewed them on the Comics Alternative. So it was really fun to when the list came out, to go on Facebook and see all of our friends and colleagues in the children's comics world talking about the PACE list and having passionate opinions. And so I think that I was really excited when you said that you wanted to put this on the podcast, because I bet there were lots of other people who saw it or will see it and will have their opinions too.
Well, Gwen, that's a perfect segue. Do you mind if we switch topics now and talk about graphic novels for children and young adults? Because I think some of those colleagues that you just mentioned, who are in this field, are well represented here in this volume. And so, if you'd allow me to introduce a little bit, and then to ask you some questions about the book. Sure. So, graphic novels for children and young adults has just come out. You should definitely ask for it of your library, of your local library or university library, or pick up a copy yourself. And I've had the good pleasure of enjoying it. As I mentioned at the top of the show, edited by Michelle Ann Abate and by you, Gwen. And so I wonder if you could, just share with us a little bit about the book, its origins, where it came out of, and and the backstory for this volume.
Absolutely. Well, Michelle approached me about 3 years ago with the idea of doing an edited collection, because both of us had been talking about how little, formal scholarship there was on a number of comics that we felt were well enough established that they probably should have had some scholarship written on them by this point. And we did our research, and we found that really there weren't any competing texts like that. And we decided we would put together a call for papers to see if there were other scholars who would be interested. And we were surprised and pleased to find that over 50 people sent in proposals for a piece in this collection that we had planned. And that was just a wonderful wealth of topics and ideas that came our way. And we fashioned a proposal with a good number of those, and were lucky enough to secure a contract with the University Press of Mississippi. And I want to give a shout out to our editors. VJ Singh initially was our first editor, and then Katie Keene stepped in when VJ was promoted to another position in the company, and Katie helped to shepherd our book through. We ended up going through a couple of iterations of the manuscript, and what has emerged is a text that is very long, and we were really grateful to Mississippi because this was really the first collection to extensively look at children's and YA comics from an academic perspective. They allowed us to have a slightly longer length, so I think it's 325 pages or something like that. It's very long. There's an introduction and a coda, and the coda is written by Joe Sutliff Sanders and talks about the future of children's comics from the perspective of digital comics. And so we start at the beginning with Michelle and I writing the introduction that tries to not only situate our essays, but situate children's comics in general as a field. And then we end with Joe talking about digital comics as the future. And in between, we have 20 lovely essays that deal with a variety of comics and a variety of approaches. And we couldn't be more proud of this collection. And, I do really want to tip a hat to the people who submitted initial proposals. Not everybody ended up in the collection, but that ended up being more because of the direction that the collection took in terms of its theme. We simply had a lot of duplication in a number of areas. But really a hat tip to everybody who put forward their ideas and to the people who ended up in the collection.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm a mark for a book like this, but first of all, it's a masterful introduction. I really love the way that you and Michelle Ann Abate really kind of mark out the territory of a field that, as we just mentioned, talking about the PACE list, is very emergent. Both, comics for kids and young adults, and also research about comics for kids and young adults. And I got to tell you, I didn't get the book that long ago, but I've already read 13 of the chapters.
Wow, and that's wonderful.
They're really wonderful. Not only because the scholarship is solid, but also the titles that they're talking about. Everything from, a lot of ones that we've already mentioned in this episode, but everything from, Boxers and Saints and Martin Luther King and the Montgomery Story in March to My Little Pony and Sean Tan's The Arrival. All kinds of comics addressed in various ways from various approaches. I think, in any collection like this, you're also going to get a certain amount of interdisciplinarity, and a lot of different approaches. I wonder if you could talk about a few of the chapters that exemplify for you the book's different approaches, and talk about how those contributors discussed young readers' comics.
Absolutely. One of the things that we were interested in was having as diverse a collection as possible that dealt with comics for kids of all ages, and that also treated comics from a variety of perspectives. One example, for instance, the first chapter in the book is by Annette Wanamaker, a professor who's at Eastern Michigan, just down the road from me, and is actually just the past president of the Children's Lit Association. And Annette writes about Jeff Smith's bone as a material object. And so for those of you who are interested and where your interest was piqued in bone by Paul's conversation earlier in this podcast, Annette talks about the various iterations of that particular series and thinks about the way that our understanding of children's books and our understanding of comics kind of came together in that series. Yep. And so I think it's a wonderful first essay because it really is addressing just those very thorny issues about what are children's comics and what form do they take and who's reading them, etc. Yeah. I would say another really exemplary essay you've already actually mentioned, and that's Joe McElligott Davis's wonderful essay on John Lewis, Andrew Aiden, and Nate Powell's March. And she does a really great job of situating that text within the larger civil rights movement and the comics history of the civil rights movement. And I thought that was it would be a wonderful text for anyone who wanted to teach March in the classroom. And in fact, I really want to emphasize that a lot of these essays were put into this collection with the idea that they would be wonderful companion pieces for someone who wanted to teach comics or wanted to introduce young readers to comic studies, because very often the comics that get most taught are ones that have some sort of deep association with children's literature already. So, for instance, Megan Muson's essay on Coraline and City of Ember and the way that those were adapted from comics into film, that's a wonderful set of questions, and Megan really does a great job of talking about adaptation theory and the way that we might think about it a little bit differently when we're looking at a text going from a novel to a comic to a film. And so, Coraline is an extremely popular book. Many teachers like to utilize it. We thought, wow, it would be a really great idea if we had an essay in here that talked about that in a way that would be really useful to educators. I have an essay actually on integrating comics into an undergraduate children's literature class. And I wrote this essay in a sort of self-serving way because so many people have been asking me that question that I thought, okay, I'm just going to write an essay essay on this, and then
refer
I can
to chapter.
Refer to chapter. Isn't that awful? But it's true.
No.
But in that essay, I do talk a lot about the sort of competencies that my students needed to apprehend before they could move forward to really get a great experience in studying comics.
Yeah.
So most of these chapters were put in this collection not only because they're excellent scholarship, but because they're treating texts that people actually are reading, are talking about. We have everyone from Raina Telgemeier and the Tamaki cousins, Jillian and Mariko, and we have, I think, an essay on. We have separate essays. We have an essay on Skim, and this one's Summer. And then I think Tamaki comes up maybe in Catherine Bailey Kyle's wonderful essay on Alexic's Ivy series, which was very sort of cool underground comic from the sort of Portland scene about 10 years ago. So we really do have, for whether you're interested in alternative comics or mainstream comics, whether you just love Raina Telgemeier or you're really deeply interested in a lot of the social justice comics that are coming out, there really is something for everyone in this collection.
Absolutely. And there's also work on the sort of borders of hybrid. You were talking about adaptation, but this is more in the hybridity of media in talking about Sherman Alexie's Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian, which a lot of teachers I know teach. And I love that there were also chapters on those chick tracks, those religious fundamentalist Christian tracks. And,
that's Lance Weldy's amazing chapter, talking about a comic that actually probably more kids have been introduced to chick tracks than they have to mainstream comics. I'm so glad you brought that up, because I think that what we were really trying to do was to also ask that question of what comics are kids reading, and Lance Weldy makes a really good argument that this is a comic that no parent would probably would expect to find in a curriculum in a traditional public school, but kids pick up at laundromats or in the grocery store or whatever and are reading them. And so we were really excited to include that essay.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a fascinating volume. As I mentioned at the top of the show, there's going to be a roundtable episode coming up on the Comics Alternative where you and Derek will speak to various contributors. So we're excited about that. And I should mention too that we had to twist Gwen's arm a little bit to get her to talk about this book because of course of your involvement in it. But it certainly was us demanding that she talk to us about it, not any kind of self-promotion, because I think the book is so, for listeners of the show, this is going to be right up your alley. And I think it's going to be an important contribution to this field. And so, I wonder, just in closing, if you have any reflections from the process of writing and editing this collection, insights about graphic novels and comics for young readers generally.
Well, it was a really great learning experience. So first of all, thank you for your kind words, Paul. And, I am excited about this book only insofar as it's one of those things where when Michelle and I were interested in putting a book together like this, it was for a very practical reason. We really wanted to have good, solid text that we could use when we taught these comics. And so, there was a definite hope there that these would be really great comics that would encourage people to integrate comics into their classrooms, especially for those teachers who are maybe a little hesitant. I think having the support of a volume like this is helpful. But we were really just, both Michelle and I, because of course we've read this book about 5 or 6 times, through, and that's not even talking about going through then for editing and indexing. So, I know this book really, really well, and I've learned so much from it. I've learned so much about children's comics, and about my definition of children's comics has been broadened by this experience. And that's my hope for readers of the volume as well, that they will walk away from this with a richer understanding of the complexity of the field. And as you say, we're sort of in an emergent place. And if this is what it's looking like now, I just think in 10 years from now, imagine what someone else's edited collection will look like then. It's really exciting to me to think that we were able to to put forward such a great variety of texts and, for investigation. And I'm really excited to get feedback on this and to continue to read the work of these really great scholars.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think as a representative artifact of what we're concerned about in these young readers, comics, which is, sort of beyond the comics aren't just for kids anymore, but in fact, kids comics have a much larger, cultural footprint than I think we have any recognition of now,
Yeah.
I think this is super important, and it's super important for a super important field. So, I'm excited, and I think it's worth celebrating. So thanks for sharing with us about it.
Well, thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to that roundtable. I'm sure that we will have a lot of fun tomorrow. I think we're going to record it tomorrow, and Michelle will be on. Joe Sutliff-Sanders is on, and Carly Grice, who wrote just an extremely sensitive and interesting analysis of Jean Lewin Yang's Boxers and Saints
yes, I loved it.
So it'll be really exciting to hear her talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, yep. Well, it's been a great conversation, Gwen.
Absolutely. And before we sign off today, we want to remind folks that our sponsors, DCBS Service and their sister company, In Stock Trades, we want to make sure that you go visit them. You'll find lots of amazing comics priced at anywhere from 20 to 50% off the list price. And after you do get your comics there, get in touch with us and let us know what you think of these books or of our show. You can contact us by going to our website at comicsalternative.com. And on the right-hand side of your browser, you're going to see a tab that reads Send Voicemail. And if you click on that, from the comfort of your own desktop or mobile device, you can send us a message through the wonders of SpeakPipe. Or if you want to contact us the old school way, which would really be exciting, dialing all those numbers, you can call us on the telephone at 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427. Or you can contact us by email at 2guys@comicsalternative.com. Or you can get in touch with us individually. I'm Gwen at comicsalternative.com. And Paul, how can people reach you?
I'm Paul at comicsalternative.com. You can also find us on Twitter, where we announce new content to our podcast and updates to our blog at 2 guys with PhDs. Comics Alternative is on social media on Facebook and Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest. We have a YouTube channel. You can access us through that. And of course, you can subscribe through iTunes or stream us on Stitcher, TuneIn, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and Google Play Music. And let me just put in a plug here that we'd love feedback, and I think Derek and Andy, of course, on the other show, the main show, I guess, always respond to listener feedback, and we would enjoy that as well, and we do here too. So love to hear from you through any of the bajillion means that we just mentioned,
or all of them, because I've said to Derek before, I would love it if someone just set out as a goal to comment to us on every single one of these ways. It would be awesome. But I think you all have lives, so I understand that probably won't happen. But anyway, you can discover every single one of our episodes, as well as our reviews and comics-related commentary, on our blog at comicsalternative.com. Until next time, I'm Gwen.
And I'm Paul. And Gwen, let's keep on reading, okay?
All right.
All right.